Alright, g'day everyone, and welcome to what I'm hoping is going to be a relatively quick but helpful guide for Terra Invicta, which is looking at one of the most basic questions you're going to face every time you load up a new campaign in this game. What countries do I go for first? Why? And once I've got them, where do I potentially go next? So let's start with the very basics. What do you want to get out of your countries? Because that's going to guide everything that you do. Nations provide a number of basic resources that you can potentially get from councillors and organisations, but the countries are often the main source of them. The key ones that you're going to need in any game are boost, which is the capacity to lift things into orbit, mission control, which is your ability to control your ships and stations. You need mission control in order to operate that stuff. Research, to get technology, take control of tech slots, etc. And then to a lesser extent, funding, although it still matters, which is monetary income, whether you're looting it through the spoils priority or getting it permanently and cleanly through funding. And then also other side benefits that your councillors can't replicate, like military strength or nuclear barrages. You might want to build a coalition of countries, for example, that has at least some nukes in its alliance structure or some military power, because if you don't, one of the hostile human factions might take their military, roll in, and take your beautifully curated, well economically developed research utopia by force, which would obviously be a suboptimal outcome. Once you actually control a nation, you get to divide its resources between all of these different priorities, which can be a bit overwhelming to start with. Every control point owner in the United States, they don't always have to be the same faction, gets to allocate basically 1/6 of these things here, the investment points, which represents the overall economic heft of the nation. The priorities are, and I'll do a more detailed study on these, economy, which scales up the economy, welfare, which reduces inequality, environment, which reduces the amount of CO2 and stuff that the economy puts out, knowledge, which increases education and pushes cohesion towards 5, government, which increases your democracy score, unity, which pushes public opinion towards whoever owns the control points, which can be really useful in some situations. It also drags cohesion up, but it has a cost in terms of education value because you're blasting propaganda at people. Oppression is shit, don't do it. Personal opinion. It reduces unrest, but also reduces democracy and cohesion. I think in most cases, especially in democracies, it's trash, don't touch it. Funding increases the amount of money the nation provides you on an ongoing basis with no negative effects, but it works very slowly. Spoils trashes the country through corruption and theft in order to give you big lump sums of money. This is useful in some cases, mostly where you don't care about the status of the country long term, or the amount of money is so horrendously great that you don't care. Boost increases your boost income. Mission control builds mission control centers, which are sweet, because unlike building your mission control centers in space, there's no upkeep. They're there forever. You pay for them once and then they're there. Plus, any mission control centers you have but you're not using actually produce a small amount of science for you. Military increases your military tech level. Building an army builds more army units. And nuclear weapons does what it says on the tin, produces more nukes. This is generally very wasteful. You want your alliance of nations to have a nuclear arsenal so other countries don't want to invade you. And because in certain circumstances, nukes can be a great oh shit button. They're one of the great strategic oh shit buttons of this game, but they're very expensive. So just take someone's leftover Cold War arsenal and it will last you through the entire game. The complicating factor though is that you can't just look at the stats of a country in terms of what it gives you. Like China produces 804 science and 4.8 boost at the start of the game, for example, in 2026. Without taking account of the fact that different countries cost different amounts of this administration cap up here in order to hold on to. Each of these points in China, the extractive sector, the regional authorities, the national industries, the security apparatus, the oligarchs, and finally the executive, have their own bonuses, their own resources associated with them. But if you want all 6, you're going to have to pay 42 cap per point. At the start of the game, I got 161. That is equal to, apart from certain technologies, the combined administration, command, and persuasion versions of your councillors. So if you were to hire someone else straight into your council, I think we've already done it at this point in the game, that level would go up. If I took Coleman here and gave him an extra point of persuasion, 161 just became 162. So while China, for example, might be extremely productive, it's a lot more expensive to hold on to China than it is, for example, to hold on to Brunei, which has a 4-point cost for the entire country. And so it's worth acknowledging that no one opener in Terra Invicta is going to be the best in every category. What they do have is different strengths and weaknesses that depend really on what you value. So let's look at some of the main ones and then where you might go from there. So I thought I'd provide this at 2 levels of complexity. One, advice for players who just want to be able to jump into the game, they want a straight set of advice, and then they want to learn from there. And there the advice is simple. Go to the United States, get some high persuasion counselors, go for Canada if you want, also Mexico first in order to get adjacency bonuses that make it easier to convince the Americans themselves. Then apply public campaign until you're relatively popular in the United States, 50% is a good margin, and then eventually start popping control nation actions on the United States with high persuasion counselors. I'm not there yet in this run, but as you can see, Elena here has 7 base persuasion, some decent bonuses, but she's getting 3 from +3 bonus for our friends in Canada. So a little bit more public opinion, and she'll start rolling relatively well. If you go into the United States, even if you don't manage it particularly well, you may not get an optimal outcome, but you'll get an okay outcome. No one's going to invade you because you have a giant military and a bunch of nuclear weapons. You're producing a reasonable amount of research. You have the most boost in the game. You'll get to space. You'll be able to figure it out and go from there, grab other nations over time. So if in doubt, nice noob-friendly opening, Canada into the United States. If you want a little bit more complexity though, let's talk macro opening options. The 3 main ones are China, the European Union, and the United States. What do they give you? What do they not give you? What are the strengths and weaknesses of each opener? If you are a relatively new player, the United States is probably a safe bet. In fact, this is where I would recommend for your first playthrough, you consider going. Why? It's that right combination of the best set of resources to get you into space quickly, while being easy enough to get into that you can usually get there relatively quickly, while not being so easy to get into that you're fighting with the AI. What the United States gives you for 35 cost per cap is a good amount of science, the most boost in the game, 8 per month, a reasonable starting amount of mission control, the strongest military in the game, and the 2nd largest nuclear arsenal. There are 2 nuclear arsenals in this game that are much larger than the rest, Russia and the United States, but the United States gives you a lot of other stuff to work with. So the strengths of the US, you can get there, and if you get the United States first, you should be able to control at least one of the main tech slots because you'll have a lot of research output, and with 8 boost, you should be the first to get a mine up to the moon and to Mars and to have your space game roaring well ahead of the AI and accelerate your game. Solid opener. On the flip side then, the disadvantage of not going to the United States is someone else is eventually going to, which means you're going to have to deal with some other AI faction having control of the US military and those nukes. If this is one of your friends or a relatively chill AI faction, it doesn't matter. If you're humanity first and the servants get control of the states, that might be more of an issue. So where does the United States fall down? Well, it's got some problems and it has some limitations. The problem is that at the start of the game, it's cohesion. Some countries don't have a well-developed economy. The US starts more than rich enough. The big problems with the United States are this high level of inequality, very low level of cohesion, which is severely diminishing its research output, and also weakening the base level of unrest. The fact that you need to do some early investment in order to get the most out of it, coupled with the fact that large nations in general aren't great, or at least aren't super efficient at building mission control, means the United States is also the weakest of the 3 options when it comes to building mission control. Which naturally brings us to a nation that actually is very good at building MC, or at least an alliance of them. Remember, we said that generally speaking, the most efficient nations at outputting research are going to be the big mega nations, but the most efficient at building stuff that has a discrete cost, like mission control, boost, even stuff like funding, are relatively wealthy, relatively stable, smaller countries. For its control point cap, for example, Germany is significantly better at building mission control than the United States. You could purchase a lot more, you could control a lot more countries the size of Germany and build a lot more MC than you could with the United States, even if that's ultimately what I ended up doing in my run. This makes the European Union the absolute king of mission control generation. Because what you do is you grab France, which in this game is the head of the European Union, then you grab other European states. Maybe it's Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Spain, whatever. And then you max that country out on mission control. You just 100% construct mission control. And if you have extra time and you finish mission control, you might also build things like funding in order to support your money income. Then, at the appropriate time, I think you can start merging about a year into the game in the 2026 start. Yep, so as of January 2027, you can unify countries. If you control all the control points in the targeted country and you have France's executive, although preferably you control all of France, you then eat that country into the European Union. You set national policy on France, you go unification, the country in question, they join together. And you get to keep all that mission control that you just built relatively efficiently in the smaller country, which gets merged into the larger, ever-expanding European Union. And in the process, you free up a bunch of control point cap, which you can then use to take over more European countries, which you can then build full of MC, which you can then eat into the European Union. Nothing in terms of these openers booms mission control, given a certain amount of control point cap, quite like the European Union. It also has a couple of other advantages going for it. It does start with, well, France starts with an army, Germany starts with investment points in an army, so if you eat it, it'll point towards a second European army eventually, or contribute about half. If you bring the United Kingdom back in, it's a relatively good country. It has an army with a navy, so you'd start with a reasonable tech, reasonable sized military, and between France and the UK, noting you have to un-Brexit the UK in order to get access to it as part of this opening, you'd have access to 5 nuclear barrages, which is probably enough to deter just about anything and serve as a reasonable oh shit button if the aliens do something that you think you need nuclear weapons to respond to. What are the weaknesses of the European opening then? Okay, so it's not going to give you the same research output that, for example, a tech-heavy China opening would do. And we'll talk about China in a moment. It also is really weak, and this is probably its biggest drawback, on boost. France does have a spaceport over in South America, which means the country is actually not that weak when it comes to how much boost you get per investment made, and France isn't super high. So if you want to build some boost in France, you can. It doesn't have as many things that need to be fixed immediately like the United States does. France starts above 5 cohesion. It starts with moderate inequality as opposed to high inequality. There's just less things you need to immediately fix. So you've got more freedom with where you go with France and then later the European Union. But the base level of boost is really low and it takes a while to catch up. You're not catching up with the US on a reasonable timescale, which means unless you have an alternative plan or you get lucky with some boost organizations, you may have the ability to control the stuff that you put up in space, but you don't have the ability to lift it there anywhere as fast. And so no one gets out of the gate quite as fast as the US when it comes to boost. The other weakness of the European Union, twofold really. It's a lot easier to get into because the economy is smaller than the US or China. You'll be rolling to take over countries possibly from turn 1. You might be dropping 2 control nations or even 3 control nation rolls on your first go in the game. Rather, you might ignore the aliens and go try and take over France as quickly as possible, for example. Take some nations near it, start rolling in France, seize that executive, lock the AI out. The downside of that ease is that the AI tend to go in as well. If you look at this game, we haven't gone into the European Union, but it's only March. It's like a month into the game. The UK has been secured by the resistance. The Protectorate has taken Spain. The Academy has taken Italy and France. And Exodus is in Poland and the Czech Republic. This means that in order to bump them out, you run the risk of starting wars with other AI factions that you might otherwise want to sign a non-aggression pact with. So it can be a bit, there's a bit of an elbow room only, essentially. That also ties into the fact that because it's easy for the AI to go into, if you don't go European Union first, you can probably expect that the AI is going to take it over, contribute research to the globals, build mission control, build boost. So they might do a reasonable job of building it up for you and then you take it over later. So if you don't want to open Europe, Europe can be a reasonable second stop. It can become your mission control farm after your primary is secured and you've grown your control point cap a little bit. Another option for either a second or first run is the People's Republic of China. When might you want to go for China and why? China is the hardest nation in the game to drop control nation on because the economy is just huge. It doesn't have the GDP per capita of the United States, but it has a massive number of investment points and the reward population coupled with that means that getting into China is bloody difficult. Just to compare, Elena here has the modifiers, but she's rolling against difficulty 28, 29 to go into the US. China is difficulty 32. It's not a huge difference, but it is a significant difference at the start of the game. So, when might you want to go a China opening? You might go a China opening when you start with a councillor that has traits that naturally fit China. Maybe you have a councillor from the PRC with a home ground advantage. Or because public opinion is randomly generated at game start, especially if you're at the Academy who tend to have a lot of popularity early, if you click in and see, I've got 50% popularity in the PRC, that bonus might be enough for you to decide to go in early. In which case, maybe you go for Russia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, North Korea, these nations that are nearby that are not rivals with China, because you do not get bonuses from taking over rival neighbours. So a little bit of a pass there on Vietnam and this island over here if you want to maximise your bonus. But if you see you have a lot of public opinion and you want a really strong economy, China is the option. It's sort of a compromise candidate in a sense. It is the most expensive, hardest to get into, but no one will dig you out of there once you get in. If you're able to break into China, though, there's plenty to like about the country. No country in the game gives you more investment points, these things right here, which you spend on your national priorities. And the research potential of this country is massive. If you want to turn it into an absolute research monster by upping knowledge, you can. And there are some shenanigans you can do in terms of expansion. Militarily, China's got a military that is just at tech level 4, starts with 4 armies, 2 of which have navies, and it has a small nuclear arsenal. I would call that serviceable. So China, US, Europe, all completely functional openings as far as I'm concerned. And they also all have various degrees of expansion options through the various research techs later in the game. If you go to the tech tree, for example, and you look at the great nations, these are expensive, I wouldn't rush them. But there are techs here, unity movements through great nations, which give you access to some truly bonkers options. Whereas Greater United North America will let the United States basically unify North America. Greater Pan-Asia, Pan-Asia into Greater Pan-Asia lets China expand enormously, up to and including eating Japan and Singapore and countries like that. And before that, if you want to, there are technologies that enable you to pull some real shenanigans with maximizing the research value of China. But that's not what this video is about. Meanwhile, the European Union can research various techs that allow it to expand not just the current European Union, not just to bring back in the UK, but also eventually go as far as incorporating the likes of the Turks and the Russians, which gives you a very, very bulky European Union that, if you've structured it correctly, will give you all of the mission control you could ever need to run the game. So those are your 3 main openings. Let's talk about some countries with reasonable bonus values as well. Oh, before I do though, one extra comment on that applies to both China and the United States. If you don't, the AI might struggle to get there for a while. And because a lot of technology in this game is shared, to some extent, you kind of want the other human factions to be generating lots of research so they can pour it into the projects that advance the common part of the tech tree. If you beat them out of Europe, for example, but they struggle to get into the other 2, humanity as a whole might not ramp up its research levels as fast. Another thing to note is that if you don't move on China or the United States, eventually there are some factions, without going into too many spoilers, specifically the pro-alien factions, that might eventually get some advantages that enable them to get there first. And then you have to deal with a pro-alien controlled China or United States, which can be a little bit ugly, but is perfectly manageable. So 3 main openers: Europe, United States, People's Republic of China, and all of them have techs that come later on, unification techs, that enable them to expand over time. A final extra note that applies to China and also applies to one of the other countries I'm about to talk about is that there is a passive influence income from public opinion that is mostly driven by how many people there are. So you will get significantly less influence having 100% public support in the UK than you will from China. You'll notice this. If you roll the start of the game and you see you have a bunch of public opinion in China, your starting influence income will be way higher. That's often the first way I notice. So there is value for going high population countries, not just because they have enormous potential, although they do require a lot of work, but also because it does drive passive influence income. A final note, if you are a utopian and you care about the final state of the world, fixing China's environment score is critical to bringing down global emission levels. Whether you care about that, your attitude to that, when you choose to fix it, really up towards your attitude of the game. But I just thought I'd flag, China is a massive emitter, and if you can fix the environment score of China and India, you can put a pretty big dent in global emissions and give yourself a lot more time when it comes to the climate. Next up, let's talk about a country with potential and a country that used to have potential, which has kind of dropped off. The one that's dropped off is the old combo, well, specifically Kazakhstan, and to an extent, the Russian Federation as well. In older versions of the game and the older scenario, there was a lot of boost to be found in Kazakhstan, and a lot of playthroughs started with a coup in Kazakhstan to rip it out of Russia's federation, set up there, and then harvest the boost, and basically send humanity to the moon using a horde of old Soyuz launchers or whatever. Roscosmos and the like has fallen on hard times in the February 2026 start of the full release version of Terra Invicta. Russia's space program ain't what it once was, so the country doesn't offer boost in the same way it used to. So Russia's not great in terms of providing you boost. It's not great in terms of providing you research. It's got a little bit of building potential. It's got some armies, but they're not superb. It starts the game at war with Ukraine, which is a problem, because if you peace out, you lose even more cohesion. But if you don't peace out, you're in a war that's sapping your resources for no... It's not superb. That said, I'm going to flip things around a little bit here, because you see a lot of discussion saying that Russia in Terra Invicta is terrible. And while I think Kazakhstan is obviously a shadow of its former self, I think Russia is actually a decent middling option. I think what takes away from it are two main factors. One, comparison is the thief of joy when it comes to Russia. Because if you're going for a country that has this sort of profile, unless you're specifically after things like the nukes, if you want a place that can build mission control, if you want a place with a decent number of investment points, that can do a little bit of research that doesn't cost too much to hold, and can eventually expand and unify, you invest in France. France is just better at all of those things. It doesn't have the nuclear arsenal, but it can expand into the European Union. It also has a lot of investment points. It can also chunk out research. It is, in fact, cheaper per point to hold than the Russian Federation, but it gives you a lot to work with, especially in Europe. So, and eventually, of course, France and the European Union can eventually take up and eat Russia anyway. So you don't need to make mega Russia into Europe if you can just bring Europe to Russia. You might want to expand a little bit Russia first, but that's the big one, comparison. Why would you go Russia if you're going France? Which makes, I think, Russia sometimes worth considering as a second or third option, but not so much the opener unless you're pushed out of everything else. The other thing that takes away from it is the way Russia is being operated at game start sort of doesn't play to the country's strengths. If we compare, and we'll talk about Japan in a moment, you'll see that Russia is producing less research than Japan, has less investment points than Japan, and yet costs slightly more than Japan to hold, I believe. Yes, very, very, very slightly more in March 2026. The stats might be very slightly different at the start of the game. Part of the problem here is that Russia is trying to be a military power. Sure, the nuclear weapons are fine because they don't have upkeep, but Russia at game start is spending a lot, maintaining 3 armies, one of which has a navy. So those all have investment point upkeeps. I think it's half per army, plus you pay extra for the navy, plus you're paying extra for the fact the armies are not in their home bases. So Russia is trying to play at military power and spending a lot of its investment points upkeeping military. What you can do with Russia is, if you do take it over, find a way to end the war in Ukraine one way or another, and then if you get rid of the armies and you keep it for the nukes and the investment points, it's serviceable. Alternatively, if you do want it to be military power, you need to modernize the tech levels. In Terra Invicta, when it comes to militaries, tech is king, because again, you do not pay upkeep on it. So Russia is a potential valuable country to include into your lineup at some point, and obviously if you have it, no one else is going to have the giant pile of nukes, which is a serious consideration. It just, without any other changes, I don't think is at its best trying to play militarist empire, if instead you can use other nations to play that role instead. Russia, Kazakhstan, it's not what it once was. What does have superb potential, but it is a bit of a fixer-upper, is India. When might you go in India start? Well, you want something different, but also there are councillors with the right set of traits that can be really, really solid. There are councillors, for example, with significant bonuses. I think it's common on evangelists who have a massive bonus, I think, for countries that have less than 6 knowledge value. India has 5.8, just enough to kick in the bonus. So you can break into India relatively quickly and easily. The AI might not prioritize it. And while it doesn't start with much of anything, 2 mission control, a little bit of boost, the research is respectable. The whole thing costs about 150 caps, so you could afford it right now, which means you might be able to afford something else. And then if you fix it up, if you scale up the economy, if you fix, and we won't go into how to do this, we might have to do specific guides on that. if you fix up India a bit, develop it, and are a little bit patient with it, because the population is so large, you can get absurd outputs of just about everything. You can get big science outputs, you can get good mission control outputs. It's not going to give you the boost right away that the US is, and I think that's what makes it less of an attractive option for a lot of new players. There's a time component here. It's not having a nation that is good at the start is a lot more valuable in terms of getting your game going than getting one that is going to give you great returns after a number of years of dedicated investment and support. That makes countries like the United States and PRC much more powerful as openers than, say, for example, playthroughs that are based in Africa. Enormous potential because of all the population, but a lot of work that needs to be done in order to get the most out of it. So 3 openers, an honorable mention, and a fun, interesting one, especially since you realize you should have cap to control other countries as well to make up for India's weaknesses. And one that I'm like, I'd probably give it a pass. Remember it's there, remember what it has, but I'd probably give the old Kazakhstan, Eurasian Union a bit of a miss. You can turn Russia into big Russia through a variety of techs, but I don't think the payoff is there compared to some of the other options. All that said, let's go through some of the interesting smaller nations that you might want to remember exist in terms of your playthrough. If you want a cheap and easy nuke, North Korea is right here. It costs 2.5 points to hold. It's super easy. It'll give you a little bit of extra bonus if you want to go into China, and they start with 1 nuclear barrage. There is literally no easier way to get a quick, easy nuke in the game. Grab North Korea, ally with something, you're good to go. Other small nuclear powers include Israel and Pakistan, both of which are significantly more expensive to hold than North Korea. India does have a small nuclear arsenal, by the way. All of the main openers I suggested are nuclear armed. If you have one in your alliance, that can go a long way. In terms of star boost producers of the game, I'd like to nominate countries like Singapore. Why Singapore? Well, it doesn't even start with a space program, so you have to invest a lot of points. But for a low price of about 24 control point cap, it has 10 investment points, which is about half of Germany. And because of its geographical position, every time it does build boost, it gets a lot of it, like significant efficiencies on boost construction. So if you have the capacity at some point and you're worried about your boost medium to long term, maybe later in the game, grabbing Singapore, completing a space program, and then grinding out boost for the entire game, just 100% full send boost all the time, might be a way to keep grinding up your boost value. In terms of little bits of extra research points at the start of the game, interestingly enough, you'll notice if you click around a number, little small micronations. Lesotho, the Comoros and Keeling Islands. Over here you got Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia. Yeah, so a lot of these little, Cape Verde, a lot of these are going to cost basically nothing to hold, like 1.3 cap to hold Cabo Verde, but 12 science. Not bad. In terms of efficiency for how much science you're getting, it's not going to like make or break your entire playthrough, but grabbing a couple of microstates early if you have just a little bit of extra cap can help you grind out a bunch of extra science. You see, I'm starting with 53 with my counselors. If I just grabbed a bunch of these microstates, I could easily double that for like 6 or 7 control points. Not huge, but it's something. Another popular one is to go after, at least early game, grab a nation that you're not going to hold forever and run spoils for a bit. This is corruption, this is theft. The traditional approach is to grab a small oil-rich country, spoils it, and use that to get the money necessary to buy organizations early and get on your feet. There is also a larger version of this strategy I've seen discussed in the past, which I don't feel good doing, but if you want to game it out, it's a version where you go after a major country like the US, set it to spoil, so steal a bunch of money, burn it to the ground, abandon it while you break into another major power. So perhaps you could go the US, steal all America's money, burn it to the ground, go into China, fix China, abandon the US and give it to someone else. Maybe you disarm some military on the way out. But yes, in terms of countries that are resource rich, the likes of Kuwait, Qatar, basically look at the Middle East and you'll find some good options as long as they're unrest levels, they're resting unrest levels. If we look at Kuwait, for example, the rest value is 2.8. If we look at Qatar, the rest value is 0. Unrest going up cuts your investment points, which means you can't steal as much money. So You want stable, you want resource rich, you want control point efficient relative to the amount of money you're stealing. Other quirks. Iran starts with 60 investment out of 80 necessary to build an atomic bomb. So if nothing changes, if a faction takes over Iran, it's probably going to become nuclear armed at some point during the playthrough if they choose to make that last little bit of investment. The UK also has texts that allow it to expand, or it can rejoin the European Union, or both. Final other honourable mentions, not necessarily saying these are overpowered, but they're interesting, just things to be aware of on the way out. Japan costs about as much to control as Russia, but has significantly more investment points, significantly more research, and has a lot of cap for mission control and boost because it already starts with the space program complete. So if you want a little bit extra research, you don't have other options, Japan will give you some research and a place to build some mission control. Australia doesn't start with the space program, but New Zealand does, which means that if you need somewhere desperately to build some MC and boost for a relatively cheap, New Zealand will set you back about less than 14-ish control points in order to hold on to New Zealand, and you can build 2 mission control and a little bit of boost if you want to give the Kiwis a win. Australia doesn't have the space program, but if you don't have a councillor from Australia, it's worth keeping in mind that some Australian orgs are very powerful. I don't have them purchased yet because this is early in the game, but if I jump over to a later save, I might be able to show some of them off quickly. There are a lot of unique organizations in a game that come from various countries, and the 2 ways to recruit it are either you must have a control point in that country or a councillor from that country. Because I'm an Aussie, I always spawn with the councillor from Australia, so this is never a problem for me. But if not, keep in mind that having a little bit of a presence in Australia can have some small benefits if you want some good orgs. I've momentarily jumped forward in time a bit so you can see what I'm talking about here. This is the Australian trio of investigation orgs. ASD, Australian Signals Directorate, gives you +2 intel, +1 espionage, 1 star. 1 star for ASIO gives you +2 investigation, +2 security. And ACES, +1 investigation, +1 espionage, once again, 1 star with some useful missions. So if you combine these together, you can think of it as a 3-star organization that gives 5 investigation, 2 espionage, a bunch of security. It's a really good combo if you're trying to stack up someone for investigation the way I have with Bert here. There's also some decent Australian Special Forces orgs, but those aren't quite as rare. There we go, there's the Australian SAS. Australia is by no means unique in this regard, but it's worth noting that nations do have unique organisations, and sometimes it can be worth paying some attention to where your councillors are from or where your control points are, just in case you want to snatch some of the best ones, or at least have the chance to do so. But there are some nations with some healthy orgs out there. China has some good organisations that can be particularly useful. A number of the European ones are pretty useful. So a little bit of diversity in your geographical presence of your councillors, handy even if it's not the absolute top priority. I also want to make another note about Japan and Australia, a reason I brought them up. If you are not going United States and you feel you need a strong military country, it's often not worth doing it in the main superpower, whether that be Europe or China, because those military investment points, those armies, those upkeeps, those could really be something else in your superpower. Japan and Australia make reasonable offhand military beatsticks. They can build a reasonable number of armies. They start with reasonable military tech score. They've got a lot of investment points. Japan is very multi-purpose, but if you just want to make Australia a militarized colony to send high-tech militaries with navies around the world, it can serve that function relatively well at a pretty affordable cost. You're looking about 40 points to hold the entire country. And it'll still give you a few other things along the side. So you build up 10 mission control, you build a couple of useful things, and then you do a degree of military investment. It really depends on how important you think the military is going to be for your game. If you're the United States, you probably don't have to invest in it very much, if at all. You could probably even get rid of a military and still be perfectly fine from a deterrence and expeditionary perspective. But if you want to be invading places, if the military matters a lot to you, keep in mind that a country like Australia or Japan does have some offside military potential. Okay, now I could go into details about how you set up national priorities and how you construct the nations, but I think that's a good overview to start. You know which nations to potentially go for. You know what to look for in terms of what they output, what resources relative to how much it costs to hold the country. You know how to think about building coalitions, making sure you have different specialized countries working together. Someone's handling the military, someone's handling research, someone's handling space and mission control, etc. But my main advice when you're picking countries is go with something, if for your first few games, go with something basic, like a US or a Europe opener, and then try and pick whatever you go for second. Once you've secured your main power first, whatever you go for second should try and cover for the weaknesses of the first one. Or just go for more raw resources. So for example, if you go US first, you might actually want to break into or try and throw people out of Europe second in order to get the mission control that you're lacking in the United States and free up investment points for other things you might want the US to do. Or you could go into China, in which case you might say, hey, I'm going to try and make China the research power, and I'm going to focus the United States, even though it's not super efficient, on building mission control, or vice versa, whatever you want to do. Try and cover the weaknesses by specializing between your various states, while also remembering sometimes there's a little bit of value in being flexible. If you don't like the start when you start the game, sure, consider reloading. But if you see a massive chunk of public opinion in China, or huge support, in this game I saw big support in Canada opening up, so I thought, hey, Canada, US, natural opening. We're throwing control nation double on Canada straight away.
Ready to go.
Better than even chance of each of those working. That might mean that within 2 weeks I could have full control of Canada and then either be going for points in Mexico or public opinion in the United States. The final point here is, how do you break into countries beyond the basics? I already talked about taking proximity bonuses. Very powerful for the US because there are only 2 proximity bonuses to be had, really, Canada and Mexico. But the second point is finding the right counselor for a job, scaling up the right counselor for a job. So finding organizations, for example, that boost persuasion or leveling them up to boost persuasion, finding traits that boost them in the right area. Elena, for example, as I said, click on the United States, base persuasion of 7, 3 for media darling, -1 for extremist, so 2 points extra. That's a very significant difference. The final thing you can do is public campaign. This will increase public opinion, which makes it easier to control the nation and also easier to keep that nation in high cohesion once you have it. So public opinion can really matter. It's usually more efficient if you already have a nation to consider, in some cases, for example, using unity, which shifts public opinion towards you. If you already control a nation, you might want to use unity rather than your councillors, because council turns are a valuable resource that are always going to be in short supply. But when you're not in there, you can't do that. So public campaign it is. And it's one reason why I'd recommend that early on, you try and go for a council that is very heavily weighted towards high persuasion councillors who can do public campaign, who can do control nation, who can do this initial scramble, and then consider firing people and diversifying your council a little bit later on. In any case, I'll probably leave that there for the moment. I hope you found all of that useful. Welcome to Terra Invicta 1.0. So good luck, jump in, and I'll see you again soon.